Yeah, I define gerrymandering fairly broadly in the book as any circumstance in which political boundaries are manipulated for some kind of partisan or political purpose. Mostly because I wanted to be able to talk about the stuff that Lincoln and some of the other Republicans were doing in the mid to late 19th century. And one of the major issues in Washington, both before, during, and after the Civil War, was the question of when US territories would become states in their own right and on what terms those statehoods would proceed. And prior to the Civil War, there was kind of this rule of thumb that was used for creating new states, under which a state or a territory, as it was at the time, would only be considered for admission once its population had grown large enough that it would be entitled to one seat in the House of Representatives. But once the Civil War broke out, and once the question of how new states would be admitted and on what terms, and the political benefits that this could potentially bring Lincoln in his reelection bid came to the forefront, that rule of thumb was pretty much jettisoned, as was any semblance of adhering some of these new statehood admissions to the Constitution.
I'd say good. I'd say good, right? I mean, that's an example of kind of these rules being, I guess, used for the better side, which I feel like it's seldom happens.
Yeah, and a lot of the historians who have analyzed this kind of recognize, as many did at the time, that this probably went against the Constitution, certainly with the admission of West Virginia during the Civil War, which had itself seceded from Virginia, which had seceded from the United States, but also with the admission of Nevada as well, which had only a few thousand residents at the time that Lincoln and the radical Republicans kind of brought it into the Union. It was probably justified at that point. But once we move into the late 19th century, what we see is that Lincoln's successors in the Republican Party kind of used this same playbook to add a whole bunch of other new states. And probably the most egregious of these was splitting the Dakota Territory into two independent units, North Dakota and South Dakota, and then immediately admitting both of them as new states. And
Mm.
so the incentive was that if you do it that way, instead of getting two new Republican senators, you get four Republican senators. And instead of getting three electoral college votes, you get six electoral college votes for the Republican Party. And so the statehood shenanigans considered well into the 1880s, even as the expediency of the Civil War and Reconstruction as a justification were no longer really on the table.
Well, and then we live with that today, where in the prior Congress we had 50 Democratic senators and 50 Republican senators, and the Democrats represent 40 million more people, really, because of the way that that was so aggressively pursued, even which is unfortunately undemocratic. But let's then move into the 20th century, because this is really when this process begins to ramp up, and there were some efforts by the courts to curb it, but they were largely unsuccessful, is my understanding. How did the courts try to approach gerrymandering as a practice, and what's your sense of how they were able to restrain it, if at all?
So the courts largely stayed out of debates about the drawing of legislative districts until the 1960s. And what ultimately prompted their involvement was the phenomenon known as malapportionment. And malapportionment essentially is a similar kind of idea to the rotten boroughs in the UK that I talked about earlier. You have a situation where districts in the same state, in the same legislature, have dramatically different populations from one another. And what happened over the first half of the 20th century is that America's urban centers grew significantly in terms of their population, but their representation in state legislatures and in Congress was not increased commensurate with the growth in their numbers. And so by the 1960s, America's cities were significantly underrepresented in both state and federal governments, and rural areas were overrepresented. And of course, the rural representatives who were benefiting from this resisted any attempt to try and reform things democratically because they were still reaping the benefits of this imbalance in terms of numbers. And so it wasn't until the 1960s where a series of Supreme Court decisions created this principle called one person, one vote, after which the book itself is named, which to this day mandates that all of the districts within a legislative chamber have to have equal populations to one another. And while this was obviously a very positive development for democracy, it also kind of served to put gerrymandering on steroids to an extent, because now every single state would have to redraw every single one of its districts every 10 years after a new census in order to maintain compliance with this one person, one vote principle. And so redistricting and gerrymandering became not just something that happened whenever politicians had a particular inclination to do it, but something that came about much more frequently now that redistricting is happening all the time, every 10 years. And this is sort of what I refer to as the modern era of gerrymandering, where something that had been ubiquitous but infrequent became an everyday occurrence across the nation.
And also incredibly racialized too, in terms of what it being on steroids by that point. How, in terms of looking at the maps post this decision, post this weigh-in by the court, how much more did that accelerate the racial divisions in some of these gerrymandered districts?
It certainly was a major component of the ways in which particularly southern state legislatures, which had previously been able to suppress the influence of minority populations through overt disenfranchisement. But with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the more aggressive enforcement by the federal government of the 15th Amendment, suddenly those traditional tools of disenfranchisement were no longer available. And the registration rates of Black voters across the South began to surge. And so what these state legislatures realized is that gerrymandering was a potent new tool that they could now use to ensure that these newly enfranchised Black populations would still not be able to have a significant influence on government. And so they used some of the very same gerrymandering techniques that today get used by Republicans to disadvantage Democrats to ensure that that Black voters did not have a voice in state government. And it took another couple of decades of litigation. It took amendments by Congress to the Voting Rights Act in the 1980s for the problem of racial vote dilution that emerged after the Civil Rights Movement to really be effectively addressed.
Well, good thing, none of that has been touched by the courts or anything like that, right?
Yeah, luckily that problem was solved and we never have to worry about it again. There certainly hasn't been any backsliding there.
In all seriousness, though, I mean, the recent rollbacks by the kind of extremist right-wing Supreme Court, now we're in more modern times. I mean, how has that affected gerrymandering efforts? I know at the same time, some Democrats are being more aggressive on that front, gerrymandering themselves in certain states once they've gotten control of state legislatures. But that obviously is only a temporary hole plug.
Yeah, so almost as soon as the decisions of the 1980s and the legislation I talked about had really provided strong legal remedies for racial vote dilution, the emerging conservative majority on the Supreme Court began to undermine those, beginning with a series of cases in the 1990s where they limited the ability of states to draw majority minority districts. So districts that were drawn primarily to allow previously disadvantaged and marginalized populations to have an effective voice in government. And then more recently, and there is a case pending at the Supreme Court right now called Merrill versus Milligan, we've seen the court start to further undermine the progress that was made by the Voting Rights Act. And so this was a case that came out of Alabama. Alabama, which has a Black population of around about 27, 28%, drew just one of its 7 U.S. House districts in a way that would allow Black voters to elect representatives of their choice. And the lower court said that was a violation of the VRA. You have to go back and draw a second Black influence district in order to be in compliance. And the Supreme Court stayed that ruling. They allowed the plan to go into effect. And when this case ultimately gets decided, probably in June or July of this year, it's going to further weaken those Voting Rights Act protections that minority voters have relied on in order to increase their representation in both Congress and state legislatures over the last few decades.
Expand a bit more on that, why that's so harmful in particular to just have one Black district, because it is less percentage-wise than the percentage of the Black population in the state, but it's more than that, right? It's more than just that difference in percentage. It's the fact that these voters are being cobbled into one district so that no one else is threatened, and that you kind of have somebody on an island representing Black voters as opposed to having their influence be more spread out.
Right, and so what the GOP did in Alabama was to pack a large number of Black voters into this one congressional district, but then they also divided the rest of the African American populations in the state among as many districts as possible. And so this ensures, firstly, that this one seat is always going to elect an African American to Congress, but it essentially ensures that Black voters elsewhere are not able to have any effective influence on the results. And this is kind of the logic of racial vote dilution, that if you submerge marginalized voters in a significant enough population of white voters, and when you have racially polarized voting present, when white Americans tend to vote for different candidates from Black Americans or Americans of other groups, it has the effect of shutting out that population from political influence entirely. And this was the technique that was used after the civil rights movement to undermine the influence of newly enfranchised Black voters. And if we see this case get decided in favor of Alabama, that's going to enable and embolden states to kind of backslide and start using those tactics much more significantly than they have been allowed to in recent years.
Lastly, that is the state of the fights on the Supreme Court level. But in terms of other reforms, what's your sense of where we are at right now at the start of 2023?
So I tried to make this a book that was not entirely pessimistic, although obviously there are a lot of reasons for concern about the health of American democracy and the threats to that come not just from gerrymandering, but from election subversion, from voter suppression, and from a whole host of other anti-democratic sentiments as well. But the note of optimism that I tried to conclude the book with is that we have made some significant progress at the state level, particularly over the last decade or so. And overwhelmingly, when the American people are given the opportunity to weigh in on this question, either through surveys or through the opportunity to vote for an initiative, a constitutional amendment in their state, Democrats, Republicans, Independents all say and all vote to get rid of gerrymandering. We have seen initiatives that reform the redistricting process to reduce gerrymandering passed in states as diverse as Florida, Michigan, California, and Utah. We have seen a number of states successfully use both lawsuits in state Supreme Courts and the citizens' initiative process to address partisan gerrymandering in their respective jurisdictions. And there are a lot of people working to try and fix this problem. The good thing is that we know what we have to do. We know what the solution is. The solution is simply to take this power away from politicians and insulate it from political influence. That for many, many decades now, we've had a system where the voters don't get to pick their politicians, the politicians get to pick their voters. And I'm optimistic because every time the American people get to vote on this, they seem to vote the right way. The question is just giving them that opportunity, putting in the groundwork to get measures on the ballot that allow for redistricting reform to happen.